thank you very much for the invitation to speak here. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's my first visit to Mexico. I've been asked to talk about why we need cohort and longitudinal surveys, and I'll attempt to do that, even though I suspect that many of you here don't need much convincing. But I thought I'd just start by saying a couple of words about myself, and perhaps why I think I'm here. In my first year of graduate studies, I went to a short course on event history analysis. From that point, I was hooked. Longitudinal studies, longitudinal research was what I wanted to do. The only problem was that I was also very interested in ethnicity and ethnic minorities, and finding studies that you could study issues around ethnic minorities longitudinally was a bit of a challenge. So from then on, I was also became someone who looked for data wherever I could find it, and used all sorts of different data. I became something of a data junkie, is one way of putting it, and that has remained. So I'm very interested in the different things, the different sorts of longitudinal study can offer me, and offer to help me answer my research question. And I'll be. I was just thinking that if I tend to speak quite fast, so please wave at me if I am going to be fast. So my students also typically complain in their feedback forms about this. I've also become very involved in the collection of longitudinal data. As Alfonso mentioned, I'm part of the scientific leadership team for Understanding Society, which is a large UK household longitudinal study, which I'll say a little bit more about later. And we have an ethnicity strand in that, which I lead on to try and give us extra information about ethnicity and ethnic minorities. I was also the principal investigator for a child cohort study, the Millennium Cohort Study, which is a UK-wide study of children born around 2001, who were followed over time. It's a wonderful study, and I'll also say a little bit more about that and give some examples. And I've also been involved in data collection of some more ad hoc longitudinal studies relating specifically to immigration. So I know something of the challenges and something of the stresses in collecting longitudinal data, but also something of the pleasures of doing so. So I will try to combine some description and discussion of different designs with some description and discussion of brief illustrative examples of what they can actually tell us. So that's my introduction. Now to get onto the meat of the question. Why do we need longitudinal studies? Well, I thought I'd just start with this quotation from the Economic and Social Research Council in the UK, which is the major social science funding body and which funds all the UK cohort and main cohort and longitudinal studies, including the Millennium Cohort Study and Understanding Society. And they say that longitudinal studies are uniquely suited to help us understand social change. Unlike a one-off research project which can give information about people's lives at one point, like a snapshot photo, longitudinal studies follow individuals through time, collecting data at different points, more like a photo album. I suppose if you brought it up more up to date, might be more like a continuous video streaming. They tell a story of people's lives at a moment in time, but also over time, showing how individuals or families have changed within a wider social context. And I think it's important, this point that they stress about context, individuals and households, very importantly, of individuals within households, which is part of their immediate context, and then the wider social context, what's happening over time, what policies are doing, how is the world changing around people. Then they go on to say, the development of longitudinal studies over the last decade has underpinned advances in social science methodology. The studies provide an understanding of social change, of the trajectories of individual life histories, and of the dynamic processes that underlie social and economic life. So I think that says quite clearly, quite succinctly, why we need longitudinal studies. The second slide I wanted to start with, just open with, is going back a little bit in time. This is an illustration from a study of poverty that was carried out by Seaborn Roundtree in 1899 in the city of York. It was at a time when social surveys were very much only starting to develop. Ideas about the design of social surveys was very much in its infancy, and I would see Roundtree as one of the pioneers of social survey, poverty survey. Now, Roundtree didn't really believe in sampling. He believed in population coverage, so he sampled quite the whole of York, at least the whole of the poorer parts of York. So those developments came later. And obviously, at this stage, there was no concept of a longitudinal study. This was a cross-sectional survey that tried to capture poverty across the households in York. But he was, I would still say, the first longitudinal researcher in that his intuition and his understanding was fundamentally longitudinal. And this can be seen in this graph that he drew, which has become very famous, where he looks at the life course of a working class person and shows how they move in and out of poverty over that life course, and how it relates to points in their lives such as their marriage, having children, when the children begin to earn, when the children leave home, and when the people become old and past working themselves. So what happens to basically to the way labourers' household income over time. Now, as far as anybody can tell, this is not based on any data that he actually collected, but it demonstrates how he understood the process of taking place. And I think there's quite an interesting paper to be written. Well, I hope it'll be written by me one day about Roundtree's longitudinal research. So, the end of what I'm going to cover today, I'm going to say a little bit more about what longitudinal studies do. And then I'm going to talk about some different types of studies, and talk a little bit about their advantages, and a little bit about their disadvantages, but stressing their advantages. And this is going to be mostly focused around examples. So this talk isn't going to be very analytical, it's purely going to be largely going to be illustrative with lots of examples. And then going to move on to the types of research questions that can be answered, because that's really why we do this. But obviously there's a stress on analytical methods, research methods and development of appropriate methodologies, but why we do all this is because we want to answer questions in the book. We want to understand the world around us in its different aspects. So I'm going to look a little bit at types of research questions that can be answered, and again, give a few very selected examples, because and then I'm going to touch on some issues we might want to consider when thinking about designing a longitudinal study, and then draw some conclusions. So what can longitudinal studies do? Here I'm thinking very much of social surveys as longitudinal, so individual and household social surveys, and contrasting them with cross-sectional surveys. So they can indicate causal pathways. By following individuals over time, you can see how one part of their life leads to another part of their life. You can track the different periods, as Roundtree aimed to do, and the different consequences of different factors in their lives. And you can enhance our understanding much more of the social world, which is really what we want to do. And you can do this by giving much better insight into causal processes. So you can identify things in people's lives that happened before and things that happened later. And clearly, the things that happen later can't determine the things that happen before. A very obvious point, but it's what underlies an awful lot of analysis of longitudinal surveys. Just this temporal ordering. That if you are depressed, you may then suffer a mental breakdown. But if you suffer a mental breakdown, you may then become depressed. If you measure this in a cross-sectional survey, you don't really know which is driving which. But over time, you can look at how these factors are related. Similarly, if you look at something like disability, where disability is often associated with low income. You might think, okay, well, disabled people, it's their disability that's causing them to have less learning capacity. But if you look over time, you can see whether it's actually those people who are less well off who are more likely to become disabled, which leads to rather different thinking about how you might intervene, how you might support disabled people, how you might support their lives. You can use longitudinal studies to test interventions or shocks. How do people experience a recession? What happens to them before and after a recession, for example, might be one very immediate, one very obvious shock. And you can look at this for different groups of people. How do young people experience the same sort of social change compared to older people? Or you could look at changes in policy and see how those affected how their lives change. The change in social security benefits, the introduction of a minimum wage, change in healthcare policy. See how people's experiences before and after such a change differs, and you can understand something about, therefore, about that policy, about that intervention. Longitudinal studies also importantly shed light on how experiences are often dynamic rather than stable. We often tend to think of people's circumstances as being unstable, particularly when we analyse cross-sectional data. So we think about lone parents, for example, but of course people aren't lone parents as an existential state. They often have a breakdown in relationship which makes them become a lone parent, and then they typically cease to be a lone parent at some point in time, either through repartnering, for example, or through the child themselves growing up. They are no longer a parent of a minor, they're no longer defined as a lone parent. And again, it's important to think of these experiences as dynamic rather than stable if you're thinking from a policy perspective. Because it leads you to think about when, where, and how it might be best to intervene to support families to change the circumstances of those who are currently disadvantaged. Longitudinal studies also shed light on the importance of duration, on the importance of how long things last and whether that matters. We typically think of unemployment being not a very good state for people to be in and having lots of negative consequences, for example, on their health, on their self-concept, sometimes on their relationships. But of course, unemployment is very different if it's experienced for 2 weeks or if it's experienced for 2 years or even longer. And longitudinal studies can help us to unpick how long such states last and what are the consequences of longer and shorter states. Another example that's been shown to be very important is the experience of poverty, which is an example I'll come back to, where poverty experienced for a long period is typically found to be much more damaging, for example, for children's outcomes, than poverty experienced just at a single point in time. And longitudinal studies can help us to analyse phenomena that are inherently longitudinal. A very simple but a very sort of policy relevant one is social mobility. To measure social mobility, you need information on parents at a point in time and about their children at a different point in time. Such studies do often use cross-sectional data and use retrospective questions, but I would suggest that isn't really very ideal. What you really want to do is you want to capture parents as the parent circumstances as the children experience them, and then follow them through time and capture their own outcomes much later. And only then can you find out really what's happening in terms of social mobility. The final point I want to make is that it's been frequently argued that longitudinal analysis focuses our attention on solutions rather than symptoms. So here again, thinking very much of what the policy implications, policy values of longitudinal studies are, I'm going to turn to David Elwood's analysis and his claims that he made that dynamic analysis gets us closer to treating causes, where static analysis often leads us towards treating symptoms. If, for example, we ask, who are the poor today? We are led to questions about the socioeconomic identity of the existing poverty population. Looking to policy, we then typically emphasise income supplementation strategies. The obvious static solution to poverty is to give the poor more money. If instead we ask what leads people into poverty, we are drawn to events and structures, and our focus shifts to looking for ways to ensure that people escape poverty. I might offer some caveats about that. I still think there might be very good reasons why giving poor people more money is still the best solution to poverty. But I think the important point that this quotation makes is that if you have a dynamic analysis, you can help them look about what are the triggers to make people fall into poverty, and also the factors that might help lead them out of it. Of course, David Arnold's analysis distinguished from demographic and labour market factors, I think, in quite a helpful way. A lot of stress thinking just about, oh, it's all about getting people into work. But if actually what's driving most people's moves into and out of poverty is the changes in their family structure, whether they have another child, their marriage breaks down, then that implies rather different policy implications for work focus approach. So, now the types of study. So I've categorised longitudinal studies into these types. And I think the ones that we're probably most interested in here today and generally are household panels and birth cohorts. I'm going to say a little bit about the others because I think they provide a nice complement and an illustration of where they might be particularly appropriate for a particular question. So, we have household panels, which take as a unit of analysis all those individuals within a household at a given point in time, and then follow them and continue to interview all the people in the household, providing a rich household context, as well as tracking individuals over time. You can think about birth cohorts, where children are tracked through their lives from the point at which they're born to, well, through all their lives, potentially, the point at which they die. And you can also think about variations on the birth cohort, where you pick a particular age cohort that isn't necessarily starting at year 0, but maybe starting at slightly later in childhood, or even be starting in adulthood, and again, you can track them over time. Administrative records I put here because they can provide a very useful, detailed source for longitudinal analysis, and they were where, going back again to my original graduate study, where I started in my analysis, because they often have large numbers, and this can be useful if you're looking at particular subpopulations. And they can also often follow quite narrow time periods, which can also be useful if you're looking at very dynamic processes. If you're looking at something like unemployment, you really want to have as little space in between your observations as you can. But clearly they do have disadvantages, which I'll mention as well. And then we can think, rather than sampling, okay, what about thinking about censuses? And about linking censuses over time, or linking a sample of people represented in national censuses over time, where you can maybe get very good coverage, even if you have perhaps less detail, fewer questions that you ask people. There are also a number of examples of short panels where people try to incorporate a longitudinal element into what is essentially a cross-sectional study and try to get a bit of value added that way. And of course, there are combined approaches where people try to link, for example, administrative records to sample surveys to enhance the value of the sample survey, or to provide a longitudinal element, or would otherwise be a cross-sectional study. And there are key points of variation across these sorts of studies. Whether you're following a particular individual, or whether you're paying a lot of attention to the household context, is one of the differences. Whether you're interested in a specific cohort, or whether you're interested in particular ages, or whether you're interested in all ages of the population. how concerned you are about the particular population you want to cover. Do you want to be nationally representative and cover the whole population? Or if you're using administrative data, for example, are you interested in particular populations, those who are the current administrative data because they're on social security benefits or because they're on the health records? And the final issue is the level of detail provided. So some of these sources provide an awful lot more information, a lot richer data than others. So let's go into some examples to try and flesh that out a bit. And again, my examples are a little bit eclectic. There are an awful lot of examples I could have picked on. I thought these provided an interesting range and also some points of differentiation and comparison. So here are some of the very well-known household panel studies. And I put Understanding Society at the top, not because I consider it the most important, though it does claim to be the largest, but because it is the one I know best. And it is in fact the most recent of these, though it is building on a longer UK household panel called the British Household Panel Survey. Well, there's a lot of lovely data to analyse as well. There's a German sociological panel which is well used, and I think people here have analysed the German sociological panel. It provides a lot of very rich data, and it's very long standing. And there's a lot of complementarities with the UK House Longitudinal study. Sort of the inspiration for both of them could probably be dated back to the panel study of income dynamics. It's been going a long time now. And then thinking more sort of child of some of these studies, the household income and labour market dynamics in Australia study, HILDA, is now a relatively long-running panel that very much followed from British Household Panel Survey and to a lesser extent the socioeconomic panel in its design. So you can see a range of different countries, some level of comparability across the designs because they were learning from each other a lot. And the key feature is all of them is that they try and interview all the individuals, or at least all the adults in the household, provide the household context. And that any individual who is identified in these household panels is, in the original households, is followed over time and followed to their new household context. So keep getting their context even as they move, even as children leave home, children then from the original sample are then followed, then as they partner, then as they split up with their children become part of the panel, so continue following them into new households. An important aspect of these is that they cover all ages. This can be particularly useful if, for example, you want to tease out a little bit the relationship between age and period, or cohort and period, or age and cohort effects. For example, going back to my example of the recession as a particular shock, you might be interested in how something that happens at a common point in time for all people affects those who are 45 at the beginning of the recession compared to those who are 25. Or those who are 65 at the beginning of the recession. Or conversely, you might want to see how the circumstances of those people as they reach retirement age vary for those born at different points in time, in which case the period at which they reach retirement will be different. But we'll contrast all of these people reaching, say, 60, 65, see how their circumstances are different. Another potential advantage is that births and deaths, in principle, allow the panel to remain representative of the population. So as the children in the study grow up, they become adult members of the study, and as they have children, the sample is refreshed. And as people die, they drop out of it. There are a couple of caveats to that. One, of course, is attrition, which has been mentioned, I think, in the opening speech, that you actually, if you're a representative, you really want to follow up people, all the people in the sample, and that's quite a challenge. And the other main caveat, of course, this is apart from immigration. Of course, immigration is quite a big issue for a lot of countries, and therefore samples don't necessarily remain representative. So some studies have attempted to get around that by having refreshment boosts, in particular of immigrant population. The German socioeconomic panel is a good example here. And the UK House of Longitudinal Studies is in the process of implementing a new immigrant boost to try and update immigrant samples. The follow-up is typically annual, so you can get good repeat measures over time, year on year, and you find that these mount up quite fast. So you don't have to sort of look around at 5 years have passed, and you've got 5 waves of data, and you can do quite a lot of analysis of those data longitudinally. So in some cases, the period between reduces. For example, the pattern study dynamics moving to biennial data collection. And just to mention one further limitation, which I think leads into my next set of examples, is that while these cover all ages, they tend to have more limited information on children within the panel. Understanding Society, for example, has a self-completion questionnaire for those children aged 10 to 15 in the household, but you know relatively little about them before age 10. And even the parents have asked some questions about the children, linking that information to individual children is quite hard. So if you're interested in children's early lives and linking that through over time, then these are probably not so useful, and you might be more inclined to go for a cohort study. So again, just a selection of examples of cohort studies. I could have picked lots more, but I didn't want to overload the slide. And again, these slides show different aspects of cohort studies. So cohort studies, birth cohort studies typically sample children from birth, often close to their birth, and then they follow them over time. And then you really can track the detail of their early lives and how that translates into their later lives. The periods between data collection works tend to be larger. It doesn't make a lot of sense to follow up a cohort every year for 50 years or 60 years, however many. But you do get a lot of rich data at the point in which it's collected, and it's very focused around the individual, the cohort member, even if they're also collecting information from their parents or later on from the people they're living with their partners. So the National Child Development Study is a relatively early example, which is based at the Centre for Longitudinal, housed at the Centre for Longitudinal Studies, where many of these UK cohorts are housed, and you can all access the data, please. And that was sampled from children born in a particular week in 1958. And so you now have a long time period following up these children. The Millennium Cohort Study is one I'm particularly a bit familiar with and particularly enthusiastic about as well. Was a sample taken from child benefit records. So it used an administrative data set which covered pretty much all children in order to sample from. And so rather than getting all births in a single week, you got births spread out over a year, which is interesting for analysis for a range of reasons. Planning of birth issues in relation to the school year in particular. And they were first sampled when they were around 9 months, so not at birth, but relatively close. Growing up in Ireland, very much tried to emulate the design of the Millennium Cohort Study, but it has a couple of distinctive features. First, as well as having a 9-month sample, it also had a 9-year sample. So it's an example of this sort of multiple cohort design. So you get a bit more immediate information about slightly older children, as well as getting information about the babies. So if you're interested in things like school transitions, you may not want to wait 10, 11, 12 years for that to happen. But you're also interested in getting that information eventually, so you do want to start with the babies. So you have both. Double go. Growing up in Ireland is also quite an interesting study because, unlike many of these, it is a simple random sample. Many of these studies are clustered in their design to a certain extent, and growing up in Ireland isn't. Growing up in New Zealand also took on board a lot of the lessons from the Millennium Cohort Study, and it's quite formulated in some ways, but New Zealand is in fact a pregnancy cohort. So its sampling is rather different because it was a recruitment study, tried to get pregnant women to sign up to the study, and doesn't claim to be nationally representative in the same way that many of these birth cohorts do. But it does mean it has information prior to birth, and so it's informative in that way. And then you get the longitudinal study of Australian children, which, like some other studies, again has two cohorts. It has baby cohort and a kindy cohort, a kindergarten cohort, sampled around age 5. So again, you get this overlapping cohort design, which can give you more immediate information if you're interested in getting information about slightly more grown-up children as well as the very young children. And that's also a feature of the Chilean longitudinal survey of early childhood. You may have come across. I've been trying to put all the websites since that kind of as a resource for you if you're interested in looking at any of these in more detail. So I didn't notice the LP site was under construction when I last looked. There's quite a lot of information on it elsewhere. And the final example of the cohort study, which we're going to hear more about tomorrow from Ms. Cornwood, is a English study called Next Steps, which instead of surveying people as babies or having a double cohort design, it was a study which started in the school years when they considered to be particularly of interest for educational transitions, so taking children at age 13 to 14 and following them annually through their school transitions from that point. So you miss out a lot of that very rich early data about their early life circumstances, but you can track in a lot of detail how they move through the secondary school system from the age of 13, the end of compulsory schooling, into post-compulsory schooling, potentially into university, or where they're part of their promotion. Here are some of the points about how they differ that I've already mentioned. So the example of Next Steps, a sort of slightly later child cohort, leads us also into the area of older cohorts. And I'm not quite sure how you define these, because they're not exactly age cohorts, and they're not exactly household studies, but they're sort of somewhere in between. So if you're very interested in pensions policy or retirement, or pathways to retirement, then you may think that having a baby cohort is going to mean you have to wait an awfully long time before you can design your policy. If you also want to know about healthy aging, again, you're not going to be around to study healthy aging if you're depending on a baby cohort. So instead, there are these designs which take people in later life. As I say, they're sort of age specific, and they start at 50 plus, but they're not a single age cohort. So you get people of different ages above 50. So you can look at the younger compared to the older and track their experiences. And there are these three which are actually designed to be very comparable. There's the cross-national survey of health, aging and retirement in Europe. There's the English longitudinal study of aging, which is English, yes. And there's the US Health and Retirement Study, which all collect a lot of information on issues that are relevant to people in their later life. Their health, their well-being, their transitions to retirement, their income, their wealth, and so on. And also collect direct measures of biomarkers and measures of cognitive functioning as well, to answer questions about healthy aging. And I think what's interesting here is that you also have this ability within these, therefore, to do cross-national comparisons, becoming increasingly interested in longitudinal studies. I think at one stage we thought it was enough just to do longitudinal analysis in one country. Now it's thought it's actually quite nice to be able to do longitudinal analysis across lots of countries and compare the policy messages. But of course, the key disadvantage is that even though you get this very rich information for their later lives, you don't have very good information on their early life experiences. You have to rely on retrospective data. Not necessarily bad retrospective data, but it's not the same as having it collected in real time. There's the main sorts of studies. I'm just going to briefly say a little bit about administrative records, because I think they're worth thinking about in relation to how they can complement surveys, as well as how they provide useful resources in their own right. And here are some examples just from the UK. So there's a study called the National Pupil Database, which has analysed a lot as a longitudinal study, all those who are in state school education in England and who can be therefore tracked. They can be tracked in terms of what schools they're at and therefore their school composition, what their grades are, and some characteristics about themselves. And so they can provide very detailed information relevant to understanding school effects, peer effects, how the school system works, how education policy and policy reforms work. And they can also be linked in, these records are often linked in to other studies. So they've been linked in, for example, the Millennium Cohort Study. So as well as having the measures you collect in the survey, you also have access to link that to their school records and see, okay, this is what their home circumstances are doing, this is how they're faring in schools, which can be a really valuable combination. And that's also happened with the children for Understanding Society as well. Social security records. So those people on social security, you can see them moving in and out of social security. So you can potentially answer a lot of very interesting questions about how people experience the benefit system and what changes are over time, particularly in the context of benefit reforms. And related to this, there's something called the Working Pensions Longitudinal Study, which is a government survey which links benefit tax records. And so you can understand people's economic transitions. And again, ideally, you can link some of these to longitudinal surveys to provide that very detailed information on earnings, on tax paid, and so on, which you can't necessarily get very well through or not quite so well through self-report. And they have big advantages. You get total records, so you do get large sample sizes, and you know you're getting everybody. You know you're getting everybody of the eligible population. And of course, that's one of the disadvantages, is you only get people who are eligible. So if you're interested in children who are outside the National Pupil Database, who are not in state schooling, for example, then the National Pupil Database can be helpful. If you're interested in children outside school age, it can be very helpful to you. Or if you're interested in adults, of course, it's really very helpful to you. Unless you're tracking the children and adults who are using these data, using comprehensive surveys. And similarly, benefit records or tax records, you have to be eligible to pay tax, and that excludes not only people who are not in work, but people who are below tax thresholds, even if they are in work. And so you get partial populations, even if you get all those people who are eligible. Census records is another example of quite useful, can be quite useful source. I'm putting it up here because I have used a study that is a linked census records, and it is very valuable for looking at long periods of time. Because you have a decennial census, with the oldest longitudinal study, you can look from 1971 to 2011, so you've got 40 years of information about people, which is fantastic. And you've got different ages as well. So it's not a local study for 40 years, it's all sorts of all different ages. And because they're censuses, in principle, you don't have so many problems with non-response. And the follow-up over time is done through the census and through administratively, and again, so you have less problems of attrition. They're not no problems, but I'm not going to go into those. And they remain representative of the population at each census point, because they use people who are born on a particular, they use birth dates. And so everybody who has that birth date is automatically included in the census. So if they've immigrated and have that birth date, or if they're born and have that birth date, they become included in it. So they remain representative over time. And sometimes you can link them to administrative records to make them a bit richer, because the big advantage of the census is that there are very few questions in it. And people often complain about the English census or the UK censuses, in particular, because they don't ask about income. And that's one major gap, but there are lots of other areas where you might be interested in that can't study because it's a short. I think this is the final set of examples I just wanted to mention very briefly. Is that, as I say, some people want to get kind of the double whammy. They want to run basically a cross-sectional survey. They think, oh, wouldn't it be nice to have a bit of follow-up over time? And there are examples of these in something like the UK Labour Force Survey, where you have a 5-quarter panel, so people are re-interviewed for 5 quarters. They stay in the UK Labour Force for 5 quarters, a bit over a year. So it's a very short panel, but potentially useful if you're looking at like short-term questions. And you've got short periods, so something like employment, exit and re-entry. One area you can look at with that. And then there's a survey called the Statistics of Income and Living Conditions, which is an EU-wide set of surveys, statistics rather, some of them use administrative data, and they're a 4-year panel. So they have information over for 4 years, and then they stop and start again. So you can look a little bit at things like persistence of low income, but one of the reasons I think why they're short panels is that they're aware that there are big issues in attrition, so you have lots to follow up. But by the same reckoning, because their main focus isn't on being a longitudinal study, I would say that they don't necessarily prioritise follow-up in the way longitudinal studies have to make it a main priority. So they do suffer from loss to follow-up. And of course, a lot of these surveys are nationally representative. They're very useful for looking at populations, and they're also useful for looking at subpopulations to a certain extent. But they're not of infinite size. We can talk about what might be a good size. Some of them are 5,000 households, some of them are 10,000 individuals, 20,000 individuals. If you're interested in very particular subpopulations, you're probably not going to be able to analyse them. And sometimes you're not even going to get them in your data at all. So sometimes it seems better to collect the data sort of fresh, using whatever methods you can to reach these particular subpopulations. And here we're going to minority group studies for a particular example where it's quite hard to get good longitudinal data. And this SCIP survey, which I mentioned here, was a particular challenge because we were trying to get very recently arrived immigrants who basically therefore don't turn up in surveys at all, and we wanted to get enough of them to study longitudinally, follow over time, and of course if they're very recently arrived, they're very mobile, so you lose a lot of them over time. So we just did a short panel of 2 waves, but it was a cross-national study across 4 countries, and so it could be quite revealing. But it was also, there were a lot of issues around how you actually sample in that. But I suppose the point more is that if you're very interested in particular subpopulations, you may need to kind of start somewhere else, and not start with the kind of things that you can just amplify your main longitudinal study, your birth cohort, your household family. So then that leads to the question, if you were wanting to start a longitudinal study, or develop a longitudinal study, what are the design issues, and then where would you start? I suppose the biggest question that would probably drive it is what questions do you really want to know the answers to? And then the related question, the one I've already touched on, is how soon do you want to know the answers? And of course, policymakers often have quite short time frames in terms of introduction of policy, wanting to test it. So they probably want to know the answers quite soon, and that may inform the particular designs that seem relevant at the time. That's not to say that academics and researchers can't be impatient too, but they may be more in it for the long haul. And so when thinking about longitudinal study, I think it's worth starting thinking, okay, what ages and life stages are of particular interest? Which ones, and if we have to prioritise, which ones will we prioritise? Are we really fundamentally interested in the early years? Are we kind of all following Heckman, thinking this is a crucial period, and this is where we're going to prioritise, in which case kind of might incline more towards birth cohort. Or are you really fundamentally interested in the ageing population and retirement, and understanding retirement now, in which case you might be thinking about an older population like the Share or ELSA type surveys. Then there's the issue of what populations are you particularly interested in. A general assumption would be that you want the national population, but do you want to capture particular subpopulations? And if these are relatively small, are you going to do that by just increasing the size of the survey overall? Or are you going to try and incorporate some sort of boost samples? For example, understanding society, it has a strong ethnicity strand, as I mentioned, I believe. And so the decision was taken there that even though this was a large sample, it wasn't really going to address questions relating to ethnicity in sufficient detail without a boost sample. So from the very outset, it had an ethnic minority boost sample that added on another 4,000 households, with all of which had somebody from an ethnic minority, which gave us the ability to study different ethnic groups and also to follow them enough to follow them over time. I think the crucial design issue to think about is the availability of appropriate sampling frames. So where you're going to start. If you want a nationally representative population, then have you got a sampling frame that will match that? Will that affect your design decisions? For example, if you might think that you want a pregnancy cohort, but recruiting in pregnancy is very rarely done on the basis of systematic sampling frames, whereas birth cohorts often use birth registrations or child records of some sort to sample from. Well, you mentioned the timing issue. How long is it appropriate possible to wait until you have some results? And that also relates to how often you do the follow-up. So there might be issues about whether you do a lot of follow-up, you do more follow-up initially and then have a longer gap over time. We're often told that we exist in a period of declining response to surveys. But there are differences across countries, but the survey context matters. The levels of response is likely to, that you expect, is likely to influence your design, your starting numbers, and also thoughts about the extent to which you will be able to get response over time, which you will be able to get follow-up. And that also relates to how effectively you can track people over time, you think you can track people over time. Do you have a very mobile population, but nevertheless you might have registration information, which means you can track them very well, or a very mobile population and no registration register information. What are the implications of that? And it may not make it impossible, but it may mean that you just need to think about putting more resource into the follow-up compared to other aspects. And I think it's worth thinking from the outset about how much information you can link in from other sources to complement or amplify your study. Often the linking in administrative data is sort of a bit of an add-on, but you could think of it being something that's built in the design of the study from the outset, and you start getting consent very early. And this has happened with some studies, they collected consent very early, not necessarily linked in. Or in other cases, you might have to start from a sampling frame that allows you to use that very register data sampling. And then, of course, there's the issue and where you put your costs. You prioritize a very big sample size and think, well, at least if we've got a very big sample size, we have a lot of attrition, then you still have some people from the next years. Or do you think, well, maybe most of our resources, more of our resources in follow-up and have smaller sample size to start off with and really focus on keeping people in the study. And I think there would be much doubt about where people probably in this room would can answer that question, but it is one that gets asked. And of course, there's later sessions which will be covering more detail these issues of response and follow-up. So, I just thought you could think about this, what questions you want to know the answers to, perhaps for the later stages of today. So, if I had whiteboard, I would write them on now. I would do my lectures. Leave actually usually to write down. So we'll now move on to the types of research questions you might answer. So now this is the substantive part. You've got it's probably the wrong way around because I'm saying you start with the research questions and then design a survey, but now you've got some idea of the different sorts of survey design you might have. Then what are the types of research questions that you can or you will do answer? And I've just grouped them here into different sorts of types of research questions. You can probably think of other examples you came up with, and some of them I'll try to illustrate. So you could think about longitudinal data telling you about individuals' development over time. And here, a simple example is weight. How much does their weight change over their childhood through their life, through their older years. Or similarly, their cognitive development. How do they develop cognitively? And what does that look like? How do you see a pattern of their cognitive development? Another type of research question you might be interested in is the duration. And the duration till an end state. So you might be interested in the time that people spend unemployed, so the time till re-employment, and then thinking about how that varies across different population sectors. So who moves out of unemployment faster? What are the circumstances? Or you might think of survival after an illness. So how many people survive for 2, 3, 5, 10 years? So a lot of medical research uses this model looking at how people survive and how that varies depending on intervention. You might be interested in cumulative effects. You might just be able to look at how things stack up. And here, to go back to the example I mentioned before, poverty resistance, for example. How many times are particular families in poverty, or how long are they in poverty for, and how does that cumulative effect affect their outcomes compared to just men with poverty, having experienced poverty once, or just men with poverty. And you can look very nicely in longitudinal studies about the impact of events. So you can look at events that happen within the family or within the household, such as the effect of divorce on income. There's quite a lot of nice research that analyses this, so how women's incomes, for example, drops after divorce and the extent to which it recovers over time, the circumstances under which it recovers over time. Or you can think, for example, about an event, say a move of area, and how does that impact your social networks? Measured at a later point. And again, you might be interested in how they recover or how they evolve following that point. And you might also be interested in events that are not within the family, but external events. External events, a change in policy, or a change in the context, in the economic context, an economic crisis, or a local crisis, the shutting down of a big employer in the local area, and so on. You might be interested in actual transitions, thinking about how people move from one state to another. And a particular interest here is often in schooling. So people moving through schooling into post-compulsory education. What happens? Who moves into post-compulsory education? Who doesn't? Who moves to university? Who doesn't? Who moves to tertiary education? Who doesn't? Who then moves into good labour market jobs? Who doesn't? And then, of course, coming back to this methodological issue, there's the research question, the idea that unlike cross-sectional data, longitudinal data can help you really to get the causal handle on some associations. They can turn those associations into causal relationships by, for example, involving individual fixed events, looking at change over time. So here, there's just examples that I've come across. So using different sorts of approaches. So does doing more housework reduce women's pay? Here, clearly, it's a key issue for the discussions around gender pay gaps and gender inequalities and division of paid and unpaid work, but you need longitudinal data if you're looking at the change of housework and the change of pay to get a proper handle on it. Otherwise, you have all those problems that might be that you can't distinguish which was effect. Other examples of things you might look at are how parents' working hours, or change in working hours or change in working patterns affect the child's overweight. So again, you've got measures of child weight at points in time, you've got measures of working hours at points in time, and you can look at how the changes of later get more of a causal influence. Or you can do something a bit different, which is using more this temporal ordering issue. Is okay, there's a lot of interest in neighbourhood effects, but people always talk about neighbourhood effects, about selectivity, the fact that people who are in a particular neighbourhood aren't randomly there. And so how can you say it's neighbourhood making difference rather than think about people in that neighbourhood that you're not observing? Well, if you had information on children when they were growing up, you could very well say that the children are selecting for the neighbourhood. And if you found this affected their adult employment, then you really got a big separation between the neighbourhood effect and the outcome to more plausibly claim it's causal, even if not categorically. So all these are sorts of research questions, and I think really of interest for research purposes, of interest for policy, interest for the relationship between policy and research. And so I'm just going to go on to show some examples. I'm not sure when I'm going to stop. Am I meant to stop? I know the stop goes on to 11, but I'm assuming some time for questions. I've missed myself. That doesn't often happen. Okay, so examples are necessarily going to be selected, and as a means of selecting them, I thought about this quite a lot, and I was thinking about using all sorts of different things, and I thought, well, I'll just use one for my research, partly because it gives me a rule to follow, and partly because then I'll know more about them if there are questions. But that means, of course, that it doesn't represent a full range of the sorts of questions that are of interest to you or that you could address. And I'm particularly interested in ethnicity and ethnic differences, as I've already mentioned, but I'm also particularly interested in child welfare and child poverty. So the examples will veer towards these areas. But I would say that just because I'm particularly interested in children and child welfare and child poverty doesn't necessarily mean that I would prioritise birth cohorts over other sorts of analysis. And I've carried out analysis of child outcomes using household panel data as well as cohort studies. So I just hope this gives you a flavour of some of the sorts of things that might be of interest, might be possible to do, and that we can maybe discuss more how this relates then to design issues. So this is an example of that sort of development over time type research question. And the question that we were asking was, are there differences in the development of behavioural problems in the early years between disabled and non-disabled children? So in general, we think that the young children have tended to show quite often bad behaviours, like behavioural problems, but these tend to decline over time as they enter the school and as they grow out of the terrible twos. And we were interested in whether this was the same story for disabled children as it was for non-disabled children. And for this, we used the Millennium Cohort Study. So looking at the UK, in fact, we focused specifically on England in the study. And here we were using repeat measures of behavioural problems. These measures of behavioural problems were measured at ages 3, 5, and 7 from parent report rather than direct observation. And so we used closed curve analysis to look at development and then see, okay, accounting for individual differences, intra-individual differences, were there differences between disabled and non-disabled children? And in very brief, we found that non-disabled children's behaviour tends to improve over time, but disabled children's behaviour tends to plateau or deteriorate. And we looked at different domains of behaviour, and even different lots of different measures of disability as well. But here is just one example. So this is an example of peer problems as one domain of behavioural problems. And you can see that for non-disabled children, which is the bottom line, as they get older, as they reach school entry age, their behaviour tends to, their behavioural problems tend to decline, so their behaviour tends to improve. But you can see that it's quite different for disabled children. It's also quite different between boys and girls, so you get quite a distinct difference between disabled boys and disabled girls. But in both cases, you don't see this nice decline. In fact, you see really a much higher level that tends to be relatively flat. So that leads to thinking about, okay, so if disabled children start off before school with higher behavioural problems, then school really doesn't seem to be helping them. Once they're in school, things aren't getting better. So what might the implications of that? What might the implications of that for how schools deal with children? And these were net of all other sorts of factors that we thought might be related to both behavioural problems and to disability. And this is still being explored. That's one sort of. Child poverty dynamics is an area that's been a lot studied with longitudinal data. There's interest in how poverty duration or child poverty persistence varies across children, how it varies over childhood as well. And here I am going to draw a little bit on other people's research. So there's this question about the extent to which poverty touches children's lives at all, and the extent to which it's persistent over periods. So if you measure child poverty at any point in time, you'll get one number, but a lot more children are touched by poverty at some point. The longitudinal data will show you that. And then a small minority of those children will be touched by poverty because they'll be in poverty for a long period. And that's likely to have much severe consequences for their outcome. And you can think of this as an interesting question in itself. Okay, let's look at poverty persistence and as an outcome. Let's look at what factors related to poverty persistence. But you can also look at it as a predictor. Okay, so then how does poverty persistence affect other aspects of children's lives, like their cognitive development, their behaviour, and so on. And this is an illustration from other people's work. Bradbury and others. And I think it's just quite a nice illustration because it shows how, as you plot over time, you find that there's increasing numbers of children who are counted as poor. That's the top part of the panel. So you get really quite large numbers of children who are ever poor if you follow children up for a number of years. And conversely, if you look how many of those children who are poor stay poor consistently, you get a decreasing number of children. But you don't get no children, so you might be this might be where you're concerned. Which children are still poor after 4, 5, or even 10 years? This is looking at the question slightly perhaps more simply. This is using a learning cohort study, and this is just counting across the 5 weeks of the learning cohort study how many children were never poor and how many were poor once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, or the maximum of 5 times. And you can see that fewer than half were never touched by poverty. So poverty isn't something that is just a characteristic of a particular minority of children. It's something that a lot of children, the slight majority of children experience at some point. But then you get this very small group of children who are consistently poor across their early childhood. And then again, using the learning cohort study here, just again a very simple analysis, just choosing the first 2 weeks. You can look at transitions, and controlling for other factors, looking at the transitions across ethnic groups. So you can see what are the probabilities of exiting poverty, and how does that vary for ethnic groups, controlling for other factors, and how does it vary for family type. But I think what stands out here is the lower rates of exiting poverty in some minority groups, even when you control for a lot of other stuff. And then you can look at probabilities of entry. Similarly, those same groups that looked like they were lower, that had lower chances of exiting poverty, also have higher rates of entry. So they're getting it from both directions, which doesn't necessarily have to happen, because you can imagine that poverty is driven either by lower exits or by higher entries, or as in this case, it can be by both. And that means, of course, that when you look at persistence, you have much higher rates of poverty persistence among those who have both lower exits and higher entries. That's what's explained. And then you can go further and look at what the triggers are in a sort of Bain and Elwood style, whether these are demographic factors or work factors driving these exits, how much they vary across every group. But leading on from this thinking about triggers and how they affect things, you can also think about particular events, and how events affect that people experience between one measurement point and the next measurement point affect their outcomes. And here again, looking at labour force outcomes, and again looking across different ethnic groups. So this is looking at entries into labour force participation and exits from, and can we understand some of the differences between ethnic groups in terms of their differences in events? Are some more likely to experience partnership or end of a partnership, or an increase or a decrease in household income, or a child entering the household, a child being born, effectively, or a child reaching school age. And we find that these events can explain a little bit of the differences, but really some differences nevertheless remain. So we have differences in transitions. Again, this point that actually a difference at a stated point of time may be driven by higher entries or lower exits, or both. And we have some differences. The Black African women had higher entry rates into the labour force. The Pakistani Bangladeshi women had lower entry rates. And Pakistani Bangladeshi women also had higher exit rates. So even those who are in the labour market were more likely to exit. And I think this is quite important because we often think about Pakistani Bangladeshi women labour force participation as being very low, but also thinking of it in a very static way. And I think it'd be very interesting to know more about these women who are in the labour force. So they're not ones who've just opted out, they've gone to the labour force, and nevertheless they're exiting higher rates. And this is just the simple sort of issue that we were trying to explain. So you've got the differences in participation, these very low participation rates of Pakistani and Bangladeshi women that are often talked about, but are seen, as I say, in a very static model. And then you can see here how Pakistani and Bangladeshi women both have lower entry rates and higher exit rates. And that changes the way you think about policy implications. There are various points. There's been a discussion of the methodological issues and the methodological advantages of longitudinal studies. But on the other side, I'd like to say that a lot of analysis of longitudinal studies is very simple, is very straightforward, and is basically cross-sectional in analytical approach, and is simply driven by the fact that we have this temporal ordering. You see this in a lot of research that claims to be longitudinal, but actually analysis methods are fundamentally cross-sectional, but they're using the data to say, okay, well, this happened before and this happened afterwards, and therefore we're positing that the pattern of association is in this direction, which you can't do so convincingly with cross-sectional data. You still can't claim that it's causal rather than associational, but you can say it's more plausibly that it was causal. And so I thought I would give an example of that sort of analysis, because I think it's important to remember that we don't need to do things that are very complicated to capitalise on and to make most of these studies. And with something like the millennium cohort study, I would say that probably 70 to 80% of the analysis that takes place in this. I'm making this number up, by the way, but I would say I would estimate it's that proportion of the analysis of the millennium cohort study is using this quite simple approach rather than doing fancy economic methods that are contributed engaging. So that's not very clear. So what we did was we were looking in this study, we were just looking at a range of educational and cognitive outcomes at age 7, and when we were looking at family factors that might be associated with them. And all we did was measure the family factors before age 7. So at age 5, mostly, some of them at age 3, or some of them when the child was born, like the child's birth rate, when the child was born. And then saying, okay, what family factors measured before age 7 are associated with differences in cognitive and educational outcomes at age 7. And we found that a lot of factors associated with them, but we found consistently that even when you're controlling loads of other stuff, poverty was associated with poorer educational and cognitive outcomes on average. And that the people who commissioned this research really wanted us to kind of explain this. They wanted to explain by other things, but we couldn't explain the effect of poverty. And that's consistent with a lot of other research, which in particular found persistent poverty impacts cognitive and education outcomes, even when you're controlling for differences in parenting, differences in family education, differences in all sorts of household factors. And so it means it's a puzzle to explain what is it about poverty that affects child outcome. But also we highlighted, and I think it's important to remember in some of this poverty analysis, that there was still huge variation across children. While the averages were different, the variance was enormous. The poverty was predicted, but it wasn't deterministic. This is turning to a longer period example, and I think there's a lot of interest in social mobility, so I thought I would just show this example, and also because it uses a long time period. So this is using this linked survey data that I mentioned, and I've done done sort of repeated times. Every time a new census comes in, kind of updated. So we look at what the child's experience, household experience is in 71, 81, or 91. So the child is the unit. The child member of the study is the unit of analysis. And so you can measure their parents' situation directly. You don't require a retrospective recall. And then you can say, okay, what's the child doing on their labour market output later in 2001 or 2011? So you're not using the recall, which I think is particularly important when you're looking at cross-ethnic groups, because they might be recalling something which is in a country of origin, rather than a country of destination, which we want. And also you're removing a lot of information from their output. And I think this is an interesting question because while there's a massive interest in social mobility in a lot of countries, and there's an awful lot of interest in ethnic disadvantage, these two things are very rarely brought together. So people talk about ethnic disadvantage, but don't think, okay, well maybe that ethnic disadvantage is partly driven by the fact that we're not a very socially mobile society, and these second generation ethnic minorities have disadvantaged parents. And you can explain quite a lot by those means. This is just a very simple illustration which shows origins by destination. You can see that in the early period among the parents, working class, which is the third column, was the dominant occupation of the parents. And by the later period, it was the more professional, service class occupations that were dominant occupations of children. But the extent to which the working class origins or the service class origins translated into more advantaged destinations varied both within group and across group. So you have persistence in advantage across generations, but you also have differences in the ability of some minority groups to convert advantage into more advantaged outcomes in the second generation. And again, in terms of how we think about social mobility, how we think about increasing it, I think this gives us a really quite nice handle of thinking, okay, well, it's not necessary. Why does it work for some ethnic groups and why doesn't it? It gives us more edge on how we think about what we might be causing it. It's not just that it's advantage of occupation and position, but then it should work equally for all groups. There must be something else going on. It must be the ways they can use that position. For example, through social networks. So it's like a step towards opening up this sort of black box. We talk about social mobility a lot, but it's very private, but often don't say really what we think the mechanism is. And of course, lots of expected mechanisms are what are of interest. And then just my final example, I just thought I'd sort of I'd end where I started with an example, and this does come from my PhD research, when, as I said, there wasn't lots of lovely longitudinal data available to me, so I used administrative data. I used housing benefit data, which is benefit received by people on a low income, so they can be in work or out of work. And again, I was interested in differences across ethnic groups, and so I was looking at survival time, using discrete time survival analysis. So time to exit of the benefit data, but also time to re-entry. And there were clear differences in entries and exits by family structure, but also by ethnic groups. And I'll just show the family structure ones because they're slightly clearer. So you can plot for different family structures, lone parents or couple parents, how fast they exit benefit data and how fast they re-enter. Oh, right, yeah, good. Okay. So this is for you. This is for the questions and answers. Slides. I didn't realize I had them in slides, but on that board. Probably because I'm speaking more slowly than I usually do. Takes longer. So I think there are a number of issues we've got to think about. We've got to think about the timeliness of data. We've got to think about spacing between observations. We've got to think about cross-national comparability. We've got to think about coverage of soft populations. And think about maintaining relevance and continuity. I've talked about, think a bit about all the first four things in terms of issues of longitudinal data. What are challenges to it? I've talked about advantages, these are the challenges to it, but I think there's also this further challenge of maintaining relevance and continuity. So we start with a group who we're interested in, we start with a population we're interested in, we ask them questions of interest at the time. Do those questions stay of interest? Because we want to keep asking them the same questions for longitudinal analysis and continuity, but people may no longer be interested in these questions. How do we deal with that? And in conclusion, this is all the reasons why longitudinal studies are important. I think you'll have the slides, you can have those. And I just wanted to end also, if longitudinal analysis is one of my it was my second love, I'll go back to my first love, which was Anglo-Saxon literature, to end with this quotation from the Venerable Bede, who wrote a history of the Church of England when he was sitting in a monastery in Northumbria in the north of England in 731. And this is perhaps one of the most famous passages where he talks about, there's a discussion about Christianity going on in a hall. He talks about, one person says, the present life of man upon earth seems to me, in comparison with that time which is unknown to us, like to the swift flight of a sparrow over the house, wherein you sit at supper in winter with your ealdormen and thanes while the fire blazes in the midst and the hall is warmed, whether wintry storms of rain or snow are raging abroad. The sparrow, flying in at one door and immediately out at another, whilst he is within, is safe from the wintry tempest. But after a short space of fair weather, he immediately vanishes out of your sight, passing from winter into winter again. So this life of man appears for a little while, but of what is to follow or what went before, we know nothing at all. Now maybe it's ambitious to think that a longitudinal study can follow people from before their birth into the afterlife. It may be ambitious, but maybe not impossible. An ambition to end.
Thank you very much, Lucinda. And we open for some questions to the audience. There is
Hi, Martin Lajoux, National Institute of Public Health. Very interesting talk. I was wondering, many of the examples you provided were weighted towards studies that are represented, are nationally represented. However, at least in health, the most influential, long-standing studies, for instance, like the Nurses' Health Study, which has followed 100,000 individuals since 1976, really is not a representative set of the U.S. population. Should we be worry less? I mean, for long-term studies, should we worry less about the representativeness of the population, or about populations that we can effectively follow over a long period of time?
Well, I think that's, it's a very kind of fundamental question. I think the ambition often is to really start with a representative population. So a lot of people would argue, I think, that if you're measuring associations between things that happen earlier and things that happen later, well, then representativeness doesn't matter so much. I suppose what your question also raises, though, is whether you even if you're not representative, whether you have coverage of all the populations you're interested in. If you've got a very selective sample, you may never be able to cover populations which are important in the overall population. You see the difference? So you might not worry about the fact that you had some non-response bias so much. I mean, that's a question of debate, it needs to be covered a bit later. But you might be worried that you couldn't cover, say, those who you missed out non-taxpayers altogether of your whatever study you were covering, or you missed out those who were over a certain age, or if you missed out altogether certain populations. I think the study you're referring to, you said what was the population?
The Nurses' Health Study.
So it's just nurses.
Yeah, it's 120,000 nurses in the US.
So in a sense, I mean, it's coverage of nurses, and so that's the issue about the one I was making about the ministry data as well. You have very good coverage of a particular population, and you can answer questions relating to that population, but you can only ever answer questions.
No, but I mean the reason it was not that study specifically. The fact that they used nurses was not that they never attempted to have a representative sample of nurses.
All right.
So the questions are not related to nurses themselves. These are medical questions. So questions about relationships between lifestyle and medical outcomes. So the reason they found this group, or they used this group, is that to ensure that they could follow them up for 40 years.
Yes. Well, and then you do get lots of useful and valuable and important information, I would say. But it will always be a vexed question, and it will be one that people continually have to defend, as to whether you can fully generalise from these findings. And I think there are some studies in the UK as well doing this, a study of civil servants, which again wasn't so much interested in people civil servants, it was interested in health questions, so stress related. And you can say those are very important questions and they give us a lot of insight, but they're often hedged around by caveats of supply and everyone. I think we should be, I think we can be reasonably robust if we're convinced about relationships. Then that's fine. But it's often, I think, used in sort of health, as you say, health studies, and it does mean that you are restricted to a particular set of questions. So if you're happy with that. But I don't, I have this issue about size. I fail to see why you need 120,000 unless because you think you'll capture things that are quite low incidence. So again, a medical issue. Whereas smaller studies, not driven by so much by medical agendas, will capture, you might have enough power much more. So again, it depends on your priorities. That sounds like a bit of a cop-out, but I think it's sort of, these fundamental questions really about what's your priorities.
Thank you very much for laying out this marvelous panorama of longitudinal studies for us. I have one little question I'd love for you to comment on. At times it seemed that you were using household and family interchangeably. And so what I'd like you to comment on is the following. Who is in the household is not always random or exogenous. It's the result of a behavioral process, and a behavioral process that affects decisions in the household. So, for example, just to think of two topical domains. One is requests. A lot of things that people do, they do because of decisions that their parents in other households are making. And then, of course, in migration, this is, as you know, a marvelous example of that. So, what do you think about the necessity for interviewing all relevant people, whether or not they are in the household, but they are relevant for the topic under study?
I think that's an excellent point, and I think we are quite trapped in a household model of how families or how relationships work, and that is perhaps increasingly less the case, and is also very much less the case for example, those transnational lives, as we pointed out. I think it would be wonderful to at least expand the role of people we consider as significant others who try to interview. It becomes quite a practical issue. But I don't think it's an insoluble one, and I think it's one we should push more. And I did try to push a little bit on understanding society. I didn't get very well. But I think it's one that we should keep on the table. I think it's very important.
Thank you. There is space for probably one or two more questions. Then
Thank you, Lucinda. This is Lucinda Gutierrez from the Mexican Ministry of Health. Obviously, the question that I would like to ask you, considering that you are coming from the EU area, is can you share with us any experience on how any of the results from the examples that you presented was taken into account for policy-making decisions, either in the UK, EU, or any other context, the regional, for example, England or Scotland. That would be an interesting issue for linking all this issue of the technicalities of the studies that we are going to be discussing in the next 2 days?
No, I think that's a very good question. I haven't come prepared for the answers, but I can think of some examples. I would also start with the caveat as well. Policy is very mobile, so you start off thinking you're going to make it on board, and then a new administration comes in. And I think a very good example of an area that has been taken on board by policy is the issue of child poverty persistence. They started including in the child poverty measures in the UK a measure of poverty persistence as well as point in time, and they monitored this. And that was using a three-sector test of understanding society. And that came in, and that came in the Child Poverty Act. And at around that, as well as having been measured in national statistics much longer. That wasn't my work, but I think that whole area has had quite an impact. Where I came in was I was commissioned to do some work on child poverty and ethnicity, and tried to inform some of the child poverty discussions leading up to that act. And there was a lot of interest, and then it kind of dissipated. And so ethnicity is actually never mentioned in the Child Poverty Act or in the white paper, even though there was sort of discussion in the pre-paper. So you get hopeful and then things disappear. Areas where there has been direct, other areas where there's been direct impact. Oh yes, and also the current government in the UK is now getting rid of the child poverty measures. So again, we're a bit susceptible to the changing policy climate, which I think is quite a disaster. And from a policy. Other areas, well, again, it's not a particularly positive example, but I think the example from the report that I showed you about the age 7 outcomes, this was commissioned by the Department for Education. And they were very interested in knowing what affects children's age 7 problems with education outcomes. The only problem was that when we told them, we came up with the wrong answer for them. Again, this was when there was this very great enthusiasm saying it wasn't poverty that mattered, it was other things. And our results kept coming up with poverty. We were sent away to reanalyse and do different sorts of analysis and come back and do things. We did it all, but we got all we could say was this was the data. And so what had been seen to be something which had been directly commissioned and therefore should influence policy, again, because it didn't fit the particular policy discourse, didn't work. I think areas that maybe have where there has been a little bit more recognition and influence, possibly on social mobility work. Social mobility has this wide cross-party support in the UK, even though many of the politicians don't really know what they mean by social mobility. They all endorse it. It's all of it. And the work looking at social mobility and looking at ethnic difference in social mobility did quite a lot of policy discourse into policy papers. It's been very widely cited. And the politicians did seem to take it on board. And I actually, I was invited to go and speak to them directly and cross-party again. So I would say that was one that was more successful. Just took it. And I think you just have to keep trying because I think it is relevant for policy, and it's just you have to work a little bit with the constraints of any particular administration.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to stop there because we have to just right on track. Thank you very much, Lucinda. You did a fantastic work.
And I'm here for the whole 2 days, so if you do want to ask me questions, I'm sorry for going over time.
Thank you, Lucinda. Thank you very much. So we have 15